saying is that Israelites are called to be set apart and to become one with the Lord.
Set apart from whom?
Set apart from their living testimony. Set apart
From who? Who are they supposed to be
The
distinct
nations
from?
all
The
around
nations
them.
around
The
them.
nations, yes.
So the Egyptians where they came from and the
Yeah.
Canaanites where they're
Yeah.
going. Yep. Mm-hmm. And what kinds of things characterized the Egyptians and the Canaanites?
sexual perversion.
Sacrifice of children and sexual perversion. Like that, we got loads of that in chapter 18. Like, it's really shocking when you read through chapter 18, just the list of all the sexual sins that he has, but what's more shocking is that he's describing the way the Canaanites live. And it's a bit horrific. And so, when the people of Israel move into the land of Canaan, the Lord does not want them looking like everybody else because they don't serve the same God that everybody else does. The Lord is their God, and if they belong to Him, they should look different. And in their worship practices, in their sexual practices, they should be very distinct from the nations around them. Not just because He wants them to be different, but because He wants to call the nations to Himself, to the living God, and His way is better. So, yes, lots of things about holiness, holiness just meaning belonging to the Lord. So, lots of things about holiness and what it looks like to be the Lord's. Okay, what else from the last couple chapters?
It echoed the Ten Commandments.
Last week, yes, in chapter 19, we got a bunch of stuff that echoed the Ten Commandments. We got a whole smorgasbord of different commands that are, it's like it's supposed to be a sampler of what holiness looks like. What kinds of things were covered in chapter 19?
Having fair wages and not lying and deceiving people.
Right? Mm-hmm. What else?
Respect parents.
Respecting your parents. What else?
Observe the Sabbath.
Yes. What else?
Don't mistreat strangers.
Yes. Mm-hmm. What else?
Don't prostitute your daughter.
Mm-hmm. What else?
Don't turn to idols.
Yes.
When to be with the harvest.
Yep. So dealing with your harvest.
And the fruit trees.
The fruit trees.
Treat the foreigner in your land well,
Yes.
and the poor.
Yep. Don't mix the seeds in your field. Don't mix the fabric in your clothes. Don't mix animals,
Purity.
right?
Purity.
Because there's this picture of purity that's supposed to be worked through all of life. What else?
Don't show partiality.
Mm-hmm.
Pervert justice.
That's right. So we got a broad range of commands about what not to do and what to do because holiness, how much of life does holiness cover? 2 hours on Sunday morning?
No. Your whole heart.
24/7, your whole heart. Like the whole of life is affected by belonging to the Lord. So everything that you do, from the time you get up till the time you go to bed, there's a mindfulness about the fact that you belong to the Lord and He's called you to be holy if you are His. So in all the big and small things of life, the Israelites have to be very mindful that they belong to the Lord, and what does His character look like worked out in just the everyday things of life. Okay, now, this week, so chapter 18 prohibited the Israelites from following the sinful practices of their neighbors. Chapter 19 broadened that instruction with a whole range of commands. And now chapter 20 is going to go back to the sins of chapter 18, and it's going to provide a variety of examples along with the penalties for committing those particular sins. Now, the laws that follow in this chapter, they're arranged partly by theme, but also by penalty. And the three main penalties that are described, they're listed from most to least severe. So one penalty is death. That covers a whole bunch of things. And then being cut off, and then having one's genealogy cut off. So we'll talk about that as we go through it, but we'll start, it'll go from most to least severe in penalty. Okay, let's look at chapter 20. Let's just read through.
You can look at it and I do what you think.
The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, any Israelite or any alien living in Israel who gives any of his children to Molech must be put to death. The people of the community are to stone him. I will set my face against that man, and I will cut him off from his people, for by giving his children to Molech he has defiled my sanctuary and profaned my holy name. If the people of the community close their eyes when that man gives one of his children to Molech and they fail to put him to death, I will set my face against that man and his family and will cut off from their people both him and all who follow him in prostituting themselves to Molech. I will set my face against the person who turns to mediums and spiritists to prostitute himself by following them, and I will cut him off from his people. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and follow them. I am the Lord who makes you holy. If anyone curses his father or mother, he must be put to death. He has cursed his father or his mother, and his blood will be on his own head. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. If a man sleeps with his father's wife, he has dishonored his father. Both the man and the woman must be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man sleeps with his daughter-in-law, both of them must be put to death. What they have done is a perversion. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man lies with a man as one lies with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They must be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man marries both a woman and her mother, it is wicked. Both he and they must be burned in the fire so that no wickedness will be among you. If a man has sexual relations with an animal, he must be put to death, and you must kill the animal. If a woman approaches an animal to have sexual relations with it, kill both the woman and the animal. They must be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man marries his sister, the daughter of either his father or his mother, and they have sexual relations, it is a disgrace. They must be cut off before the eyes of their people. He has dishonored his sister and will be held responsible. If a man lies with a woman during her monthly period and has sexual relations with her, he has exposed the source of her flow, and she has also uncovered it. Both of them must be cut off from their people. Do not have sexual relations with the sister of either your mother or your father, for that would dishonor a close relative. Both of you would be held responsible. If a man sleeps with his aunt, he has dishonored his uncle. They will be held responsible. They will die childless. If a man marries his brother's wife, it is an act of impurity. He has dishonored his brother, and they will die childless. Keep all my decrees and laws and follow them, so that the land where I am bringing you to live may not vomit you out. You must not live according to the customs of the nations I am going to drive out before you. Because they did all these things, I abhorred them. But I said to you, you will possess their land. I will give it to you as an inheritance, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has set you apart from the nations. You must therefore make a distinction between clean and unclean animals, and between unclean and clean birds. Do not defile yourselves by any animal or bird or anything that moves along the ground, those which I have set apart as unclean for you. You are to be holy to me, because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the nations to be my own. A man or woman who is a medium or spiritist among you must be put to death. You are to stone them. Their blood will be on their own heads. Whew. Okay, how does the chapter open in verses 1 to 5?
The Lord spoke to Moses.
Yep, as he continues to do. Why does that matter?
All these instructions come from the Lord.
Yes, so it's not a matter of the people deciding for themselves how they're going to structure their society and how they're going to live. If they start doing that, it'll take about 2 minutes before they look like the Canaanites. So it matters that all of these instructions are instructions the Lord gives to the people. Okay, now, what's the first thing he says to them in verses 2 to 5?
No parent is to give a child to Molech. If so, they will be put to death by stoning.
Yep.
The Lord will set his face against him, and he shall be cut off from his people. All because he has defiled the Lord's temple and profaned his holy name, he will be cut off, including any who follow him.
Yes. Okay, now the structure of this chapter is an inversion of chapter 18. So what I mean by that is chapter 18 puts sexual sins at the beginning and the end, with idolatry sandwiched in the middle. Chapter 20 is going to do the opposite. It's going to put idolatry at the beginning and the end, with sexual sins sandwiched in the middle. And by doing that, there's an emphasis on the connection, not just between idolatry and immorality, but between idolatry and sexual immorality. They are connected. So we start with the sin of idolatry, and more specifically, of anybody, and you notice it's native-born or foreigner, doesn't matter who it is, anybody who sacrifices their children to Molech. Now, we talked about this before, but Moloch was the god of the Ammonites, and child sacrifice was typically done by burning the child alive. It was horrific, and it sort of represents the worst of the worst in pagan religion. And the Lord says anyone in Israel who does that must be executed by public stoning. Why do you think that he requires the community to participate in the execution of somebody who does that?
So they know that it's very wrong.
And so that they are involved in rejecting it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if the community takes part in this, the community is taking part in the expression of the Lord's judgment. Now, he says he will set his face against that person. What kind of image does that give you, the idea of God setting his face against somebody?
Scary.
Because it's almost like he's turned away from you, or in a certain sense, maybe he's turned towards you, but with the idea of now you're his enemy, right? Okay, now why would this particular person now be considered the enemy of God?
Because they did devilish things. That
Who-
displeased him.
And who are they serving?
The devil.
Yeah, through Molech, right?
Through Molech, yeah.
That's right. Who ultimately do the children of the covenant people belong to? They belong to God. So think about the weight of taking a child who belongs to the Lord and offering it as a sacrifice to a false god. It's horrific. And the Lord requires not just that that person be cut off, but that the community take part in cutting that person off. And it's a serious threat to the faith of the whole community if it spreads. I mean, here's the thing. If you don't do anything about it, what happens to idolatry? It stays where you put it, right? It spreads, and it spreads, and it spreads. And then at some point, the whole nation gets cut off. The nation becomes the enemy of the Lord, and the nation gets cut off. So it's important that the people participate in rejecting the idolatry, the worship of Moloch. And what if the people of the community decide that instead of executing the offender, they're just going to ignore the whole thing and look the other way? What will the Lord do?
He'll turn from them.
He'll carry out the penalty, but now not just for the offender, also for the offender's family. That would mean usually his clan or his extended family, because they would know what he did, right? You can't sacrifice a child without your family knowing what happened. But if his family, assuming they're looking the other way, the Lord will cut off his family too. And anyone else who takes part in prostituting themselves to Moloch. Why do you think the Lord puts it that way in terms of prostitution?
Because it's idolatry. They're offering the child to Moloch and the Lord.
Right. And how is that similar to prostitution?
You're selling your soul.
That's right. You're selling yourself to somebody else. And the Lord will not allow his people to sell themselves to a false god that way. It's a total breach of faith. It's a profound betrayal of the Lord and the covenant that he's made with them. And if the Lord cuts someone off, well, he says he will cut them off if the community doesn't. That doesn't mean people just get away with it. It means now the Lord cuts people off. And that might mean premature death of some sort. It might mean being taken captive or going into exile. It might mean judgment in the next life. It might mean all of that. But the Lord will not allow that to continue.
I'm surprised he didn't punish the community for not doing what he said.
Well, I think in a certain sense, the punishment of the man's family is partly that idea, because you would have, how many people would be related to you? I don't know how far it would extend, but I'm assuming your family could include quite a few people. Yeah. Okay, now, speaking of spiritual prostitution, what does the Lord say then in verse 6?
Not to seek mediums and familiar spirits.
Mm-hmm. And you notice again, he says to prostitute themselves by following them.
Because they're not God.
That's right. I mean, what are you doing when you seek a medium or a spiritist except trying to go around God through a different spiritual power? And divination is a form of idolatry. And what will happen?
He'll set his face against the person and cut him off.
Yep, he will cut them off. This is something that Maybe people wouldn't know is publicly happening. It might be something that people do in secret, but the Lord will cut off that person from the covenant people. I was reading this morning and I thought of Saul, the story of King Saul at the end of 2 Samuel, when he is trying to get direction from the Lord, but the text actually says he has made himself the Lord's enemy. That's how Samuel puts it. And when he can't get what he wants from the Lord, he resorts to going to a medium and trying to get it that way, and the Lord cuts him off. So it's a betrayal of the Lord, and he takes it very seriously.
And all these punishments, it doesn't talk about an offering that could cover it. They're just done.
There is, for this entire chapter,
Yeah.
there's no atoning sacrifice for any of these sins, which is a little bit scary.
Wow.
We're going to talk about that at the end. Yeah. Okay, now what does he add in verses 7 and 8?
Consecrate yourself, be holy, because I am your God. Keep the Lord's decrees. I am the one who makes you holy.
Right. So these verses emphasize the reason for all of the laws in this chapter, which is to be holy, to belong to the Lord. To consecrate yourself is to set yourself apart for a holy purpose or for a holy use, and the Lord calls his people to do that, to set themselves apart for him and to be holy, because the Lord, not Moloch, not Chemosh, not Baal, not anybody else, the Lord is their God. And his people are called to keep his decrees and follow them because he's the Lord who makes them holy. Now wait a minute, does he make his people holy, or do they set themselves apart to be holy?
Yes.
Yes. How does that work? Because he says both of those things right here.
It gives instruction on how to set yourself apart.
Yeah. And yet you're already set apart, right? Think about it like this. What if you knew a couple who got married, and after they got married, they just continued living like they were single? So they're, living apart. They don't ever spend any time together. They live life like nothing has changed. If somebody came along and they said to the woman, okay, be a wife, or they said to the man, be a husband, what would they mean by that? If you said to a woman, be a wife, but she already is, like legally they're married, she's got the marriage certificate, she is a wife, what would you mean if you said to her, no, be a wife, or to a man, be a husband? Act like it,
Yeah.
right? Be who you are.
Be the role.
That's right. Take the
Live
role
the
and live
role.
it,
Mhm.
right? You joined this covenant relationship. Now act like that's who you are. In a certain sense, the Lord is saying the same thing about people who are in covenant relationship with him. You've been set apart for him. You're holy because he set you apart for himself. Now act like it. Be who you are. Act like you are in this relationship with the Lord and that you belong to him. And obviously that means separate yourself from idolatry. Because you can't, what if you get married and your spouse says, you get me for 50% of the time?
That's
But
about right.
but the neighbor across the street gets me for the other 50%.
It's more like your job gets you for most of the.
And I don't mean work. What if you marry somebody who says, I'll be faithful to you this much of the time, but the other 50%, I'm going to go where I want, with who I want, do what I want. What's the point in being married, right? Okay, now think about that in relation to the Lord. If you come to the Lord and you say to the Lord, I'll be faithful to you 50% of the time. But, I'm going to hedge my bets with this God, this God, this God. That sounds ridiculous, but people do it all the time, right? The Lord wants 100% of his people's faithfulness. He wants them to belong to him. And so when he says, be holy because I make you holy, it's another way of saying just be who you are. Be who you're called to be because you belong to him. Okay, now carrying on with the commands, what does he say in verse 9?
That one's scary.
Yeah.
What is it?
You can't curse your father or mother.
That's
You'll
right.
be put to death.
Yes, so anyone who curses or dishonors their parents will be executed. Now, Deuteronomy 21, 18 to 20 actually expands on what it means to dishonor your father or mother. And just briefly, This is not referring to the regular disobedience that marks most children, although that is dishonoring. This is talking about a total rejection of the parents and therefore the covenant Lord. And it's not young children who are in view here. We know that from Deuteronomy. Because Deuteronomy calls this kind of person a glutton and a drunkard, which is not what you say about children. This is an adult child who has openly rebelled against their parents. Why is that such a big deal?
Well, it seems like they would not only reject their parents, but the Lord.
That's right. It's an appropriate place to put this command at this particular point between matters of worship and matters of the family, which is coming up next, because a person's attitude toward authority matters, which means rebellion against your parents is connected to rebellion against the Lord. If you can't submit to the authority that you can see, it's very difficult to submit to the authority that you can't. Particularly when it's the Lord who has established the authority structure within Israel, where the parents are tasked with teaching their children the covenant instructions of the Lord. So, cursing their mother or father is singled out as a particular case because it's important to maintain the structure of the family and because parents, in a certain sense, represent God's authority to the child. And so to curse them is not that far from blasphemy. It's a rejection of the Lord's authority structure, which has an effect on not just the family, but the whole society. It threatens the cohesion of the family and of the covenant nation. So it's important that they respect authority. And the end of that verse adds that the guilty person's blood will be on their own head, which means their death is a form of justice, and therefore their family can't take vengeance for the execution. Okay, now verses 10 to 16 state the penalties for the sexual sins that were forbidden in chapter 18. So, what's the penalty for adultery? Death.
Stone.
What about a man who sleeps with his stepmother?
Death.
Yep. And we saw in chapter 18, a lot of the translations use the word dishonor to describe the offense in these verses. But actually, the emphasis isn't on the honor of the relative as much as it's on the fact there's a oneness that can't be violated without completely disordering and defiling everything. If a man sleeps with his daughter-in-law,
Death.
yep, and the text calls it a perversion, which is actually pretty rare in Leviticus. That word, I think, underscores just how inappropriate the relationship is between a man and his daughter-in-law, because once she marries his son, she becomes like his daughter. And so it's a huge twisting of things for a man to sleep with his daughter-in-law. If a man sleeps with another man,
Death.
if a man sleeps with both a mother and her daughter, which would be his stepdaughter,
Be burned.
yep, death, and it might mean death by fire, that happens some places in the Old Testament, or it might mean stoning followed by their corpse being burned, that also happens in the Old Testament. But whichever way it goes, the penalty's severity shows it's particularly vile. The use of fire shows there's something that has to be purified right here. There's a purification that has to happen because of what it does to a family. The penalty for bestiality?
Yeah.
Death. Why do you think the penalty is so severe for these sins?
Because they're so perverted.
And yeah, I mean, marriage is designed to communicate something about the mystery of both the relationship between the Father and the Son and the relationship between God and His people. And because of that, violating the marriage design, that's typical outside of God's covenant people. But within the covenant people, it's a serious breach of covenant faithfulness that is an offense against God Himself. And related to that, we mentioned before that idolatry and sexual sin are connected in a way that isn't always obvious. But Paul makes that very clear in Romans 1. Because sexual sin is so profoundly personal, it involves a profound disordering. And the disordering of worship results in the disordering of sexual relationships. and the disordering of sexual relationships result in the disordering of worship. In a way that I don't fully understand, those things are very intimately connected. Intimacy is sacred to the Lord, and he takes this very seriously. Sexual sin, then, means that instead of building covenant relationships that result in life, which is what sex is intended to do, these sins do the opposite. They actually tear apart covenant relationships, and they bring destruction onto families and societies. And not only that, but sexual sin pollutes, and it taints, it does serious collateral damage. I mean, you think through the list of some of these sins, some of this stuff, there's irreparable damage that comes to people and to families. Sometimes damage that has an impact on an entire society. I mean, if you need an example, you just look at our culture at the moment. Like, there are ways that the acceptance of sexual sins opens a Pandora's box that can never be closed again. And there's long-term impacts from sexual sin. I mean, think about a sin like shoplifting. How much impact does that have on your grandchildren?
A lot if you teach them.
Let's just say you do it. You're not teaching them to do it, but you just do it. If they know it, it might affect them. If you're shoplifting and you get caught and you go to jail, it might affect them. But in the long term, it's not a profoundly personal thing that affects your grandchildren. Sexual sin within your family. How does that affect your children, your grandchildren?
Stain.
And there are things that get passed on, I mean, just damage that gets passed on, isn't there, from one generation to another? I mean, sexual sin is like that in general, but sexual sin within a family, oh my goodness, so much damage. And that's not what the Lord intended for that relationship. He intended it to build covenant relationships and to build up families, not to tear them apart. And again, I mean, we mentioned this before, but just consider how severe the penalty really is. It is severe. There is no atoning sacrifice for these sins. You commit one of these sins, your life is forfeit. And there is no sacrificial substitute to take your place. Like a guilt offering won't do it. Which raises an obvious question. Is it possible to be forgiven of these sins?
It is now through Christ.
Do you think it was in the Old Testament?
No, not that you're dead.
Well, here's the thing. King David
Oh,
committed two sins for which there's no atoning sacrifice. Adultery and murder, both of those, no atoning sacrifice for those things. So when the law doesn't give you an out, what do?
Go to God.
That's right.
But nobody killed David.
Were there consequences for David?
Oh, yeah.
There were. And we're actually going to talk about this when we get to the end of Leviticus, because right after we finish Leviticus, we're going to do Psalm 51. Because Psalm 51 is the psalm that David wrote when he got caught when he got confronted by Nathan about his adultery with Bathsheba. It's a really fascinating reflection on his sin that uses a whole bunch of language from Leviticus about having his sin blotted out, about being washed, and about being cleansed. And it's profound when you know there's nothing in the law that will wash him, cleanse him, or provide him that atonement. He's got to look to God for something the law can't give him.
It was perverted justice.
We'll talk about that when we get to...
They treated David special.
And yet David did not get off the hook. There were, horrible things. Yeah, but we'll talk about that when we get to Psalm 15. Okay, now let's keep going. In verse 17, so we've had death through all of this section, but now in verse 17 the penalty changes. Well, as we saw in chapter 18, this bit is talking about a man who sleeps with his half-sister or his stepsister. I mean, a full sister would be assumed right here, but I think it's not mentioned probably because nobody was doing that. What's the penalty for this kind of sin? A man sleeping with his stepsister or his half-sister?
He's cut off.
Yes. So this kind of sin is a disgrace, but because the relationship is more distant, the penalty is less severe. So here it is that they are publicly cut off from the people. Now that could refer to either exile or premature death. I assume it means exile right here because if it referred to execution, I think it would have just been phrased like the previous verses were. And then verse 18 applies the same penalty for a man who sleeps with a woman during her monthly cycle. Whew, why is that such a big deal? Do you remember from chapter 15 why that matters?
Virgin blood is unclean.
It's a ritual impurity. Now, what's interesting is that back in chapter 15, it made it clear that can happen unintentionally, and then it's just a minor impurity, easily taken care of. The difference here, I think, is the implication that it's intentional. It's a sin of defiance against the laws about ritual impurity. Why would that be a big deal to the Lord?
Rebellion?
It is,
And
where basically you decide to set to the side the commands of God in order to pursue sexual pleasure. And sex without boundaries becomes an idol very quickly. So the Lord has established boundaries around it, and this is one of those boundaries. It's not that it's inherently evil, touching blood. It's that the rebellion against the Lord's commands about ritual impurity means that you're prioritizing sexual pleasure over what the Lord has said the boundary should be. So, it's the intentional disregard of what the Lord has commanded. That's the problem here. And then verse 19 addresses a man who sleeps with his aunt, a biological aunt. And when it says they will bear their punishment or they'll be held responsible, I assume that means they'd be cut off from their people, as in the previous two instances. I'm not positive because the text doesn't make it explicit, but I assume it fits with the others right before this. Okay, and then in 20 and 21, well, these verses address a situation where a man sleeps with either his aunt by marriage or his sister by marriage. And the implication of the penalty, I think, is that this is subsequent to a divorce. This isn't adultery. But subsequent to a divorce, they've gotten married. So think about Herod, King Herod, for example, who took up with his brothers. He had a half-brother named Philip, who was married to Herodias, and he convinced Herodias to divorce Philip and take up with him, and she did. And John the Baptist went after Herod, and this is why, because it's unlawful for him to do that. Now, it's a shameful and impure act, but because the relationship is even more distant than the previous verses, the penalty is less severe. What is it in this case? Childlessness. They'll be childless. Now, that's not to say the penalty isn't serious, because childlessness was a big deal in a time and culture where children were basically your social security, and perpetuating your family name and your property is important. And it's worth noting right here, this is a penalty that is entirely an act of God, right? I mean, nobody else can enact this penalty. It's the Lord who does it. Okay, now why is it important for the Israelites to keep and follow the Lord's decrees in 22 to 24?
So that the land where the Lord brings them to live will not vomit you out.
Mm-hmm.
You do not live the customs of the nations that the Lord is going to drive out. He gives the land as an inheritance, and he sets you apart from the nations.
That's right. So it's reminiscent of the end of chapter 18. And it's a really graphic and important image when he says, so that the land he has promised to them will not throw them up, basically. The idea being that, I mean, you think about if you eat something that's really contaminated, and you keep eating it, and you keep eating it, at some point your stomach just rebels, right? You just got to get rid of it. There's that kind of picture of the land, that the sin of the people will become so bad that the land will just not be able to take it anymore. And the people will finally be forced out. Now, of course, the land isn't a conscious being, but there will come to some things later in Levitcus where the Lord says, if they defile the land and they just continue doing that and doing it, at some point the land won't produce for them anymore. The animals will attack them, the rain won't come, and if they continue in that, at some point the Lord will step in and he will remove the people from the land.
Now, the Israelites went down to Egypt because there was a famine,
Yes,
and there's prosperity there and abundance. But then they were taken as slaves,
right?
and then Moses led them back
Mm-hmm.
to their promised land. And in modern day, the Jewish people have dispersed through the world, and like maybe 70 years ago, they got their land back. And that is the promised land. That area of the world is the promised land. Right?
In the short term. But what's the promised land in the long term?
Heaven.
It's the new heavens and the new earth.
But I mean now, I mean, there's a lot of political
There,
stuff going on
there is,
over.
but let me ask you this about the political, we might as well just jump into the hard stuff, right? Let me ask you this about the political nation of Israel. Are they on the right side or the wrong side of the covenant God?
They rejected Christ.
They've rejected him.
Okay.
So if the covenant, if those things are still, and that's a whole other discussion we don't have time for right now, but if the covenant curses and covenant blessings are still in play, which ones are coming against the people of Israel?
Well,
It's not the blessings, it's the curses. Yeah.
Does it still hold though that we are to, those who bless Israel, so now lost it?
We could pray for Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Yeah, we defend Jerusalem from the Iranians.
And yet, I would say the bigger emphasis for believers is on the church, including the church in the Middle East. So what I mean by that is, there are Palestinian Christians, right, who should be our concern as well, right?
The whole world, pray for them
That's
to
right.
come
I mean,
to
we
Christ.
pray for everybody, but that doesn't mean that we dismiss actions against the church, even if those things are brought by the nation of Israel.
Yeah, I
Right.
didn't mean to get off on this,
Yeah.
but Tucker Carlson and the guy from Texas were talking about it, and Tucker was saying, that's not, where in the Bible does it say Israel is, we're to defend it, it's the promised land and all of that. And so it kind of got me to thinking. And it was the man who ran for president, I can't remember.
Ted Cruz.
Ted Cruz, yes. Him and Tucker were at odds, and it was kind of interesting.
You have to stop and think about when you pray for the peace of Jerusalem, what is going to bring Jerusalem that peace?
Christ.
Right, yeah. But, Ted Cruz was tongue-tied.
Yeah.
Because Tucker was saying, where in the Bible, and he said Genesis. Does it say that Israel is, that we're to defend it or whatever? So,
I mean, our priority is the spread of the kingdom, and that's the spread of the gospel. Yeah. All right, let's keep going. So this bit in 22 to 24, when he talks about the Israelites not contaminating the land, so that they don't get forced out. They must not live according to the customs of the Canaanites. The Lord is about to drive the Canaanites out for the sins that they're committing, the sins that are listed in this chapter. So if the Israelites do the same thing the Canaanites are doing, what should the Israelites expect to happen? They'll get driven out too. The Lord is not racist, he's sinist. That's what he cares about, is the sin. The destruction of the Canaanites isn't genocide. It's judgment against sin that becomes so horrific that at some point the Lord is not willing to put up with it anymore. So he says, in contrast to the Canaanites, he's chosen Israel to possess the land, to have this rich and prosperous land as their inheritance from him. But if they do the same things the Canaanites do, they'll be driven out the same way the Canaanites were. And then he says the Lord, he's their God, and he separated them out from all the other nations. And he intends for them to make their God known to the nations around them by living in a way that's distinct from their neighbors. Okay, now what does he add to that in 25 and 26?
You have to make a distinction between clean and unclean animals and birds. And then don't defile yourself by, any animal or anything that moves on the ground. And, those are unclean.
Right. Were you expecting that right here? After a
No,
whole
no.
section on like
Where did that-
idolatry and sexual sins? Why do you think he threw that in right here?
Don't forget it.
Why not?
Well, it's sort of like comparing, if you do things that he's telling you not to do in sexual sense, he's comparing you almost, sort of, to unclean birds and animals.
And isn't there a sense in which you have to use the same discernment for both of these things? Right? That you have to be discerning about what's clean and what's unclean and where does it start? It starts with the little everyday things. We're going back now to the dietary laws, which these are not, it's easy to become clean again. You touch an unclean animal or a dead animal, it's a minor impurity. It's really easy to deal with it, not that big of a deal. Why would the Lord tack that on right here? Because where do you start with your distinction?
In the little things.
In the little things. That's right. If you pay attention to the little things, not necessarily, but there's a tendency then to also pay attention to the big things. If you start compromising in the little things, how long does it take before you're just desensitized to a whole bunch of other things? Like, pay attention to all of it. The distinction between the Lord's people and the nations is intended to cover all of life. So here we've had a whole chapter of big stuff, but now there's the reminder, pay attention to the little stuff. Because if you exercise discernment in those little things, it's easier to exercise discernment in the big things too. So in all these things, spiritual and physical, that's the other thing that's interesting here, is we've been talking about a whole bunch of spiritual impurities. Now suddenly we get a physical impurity. But in all these things, spiritual and physical, external and internal, the people are to be holy to the Lord, because the Lord is holy and he has separated Israel from the nations to be his own. Remember too how the dietary laws, we talked about how it's like God's just putting a little culinary fence around the people to keep them from being assimilated into Canaanite culture. Because if they get assimilated into Canaanite culture, all the sins that are listed here are going to come to characterize them. Which, by the way, is going to happen before the end of the book of Judges. Like, it's not hypothetical. It's actually going to happen that they become Canaanized because they start getting assimilated into the pagan cultures around them. And then, how does the Lord make himself known to the nations?
The judges.
By judgment, by bringing judgment on the people. That's how he makes himself known. Okay, and then how does the chapter end in verse 27?
Goes back to the medium and the familiar spirit.
Mm-hmm. Does that seem like kind of a random way to end?
Yeah.
It did to me too. But following that command to distinguish between clean and unclean animals, I think there's an implication right here that you have to exercise the same discernment when it comes to spiritual things, when it comes to spiritual powers and religious practices. Just because something is spiritual doesn't mean that it's of God. The people are going to have to be careful about discerning spiritual powers. So we've returned now to the same themes we had back in verse 6. So it's like this verse just ties the whole chapter together, and it leaves the Israelites with this last reminder: the Lord's people must make maintaining their holiness the highest priority. They have to constantly be exercising discernment about this. Okay, now, what's your impression of that chapter and the instructions in it?
Very specific.
It's very specific. Mm-hmm.
Avoid sexual sin.
Yeah, you do get that impression, don't you? Over and over and over.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I keep seeing where it's either we make ourselves gods and we do whatever we want to do, or we stop and listen. And like it said back here, you consecrate yourself to God. But I think in our own generation, we just make ourselves God and do what we want to do. Yeah, we'll take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but I'm really God in my life.
Yep.
Well, we have all kinds of things in our lives that are idols, all kinds of things. Every day, you know, we know what they are. Each person has things that.
And it shows how God takes sin seriously and there are consequences.
One of the things I was thinking when I read this is, I think you can see this in our culture a lot. Once you decide, that's what I want, and I'm going to do it no matter what God says, what ends up happening is that you redefine God to fit what you want.
Yep.
So it doesn't take very long at all before that kind of sin leads you to saying, no, this is who God is, because that's who you want him to be, not because that's who he really is. There's always this danger then of worshiping the Lord as we want him to be instead of as he actually is, which is what the Israelites will end up doing as well. They'll end up sort of making up their own God and calling him by the Lord's name, but then living however they want, because they're not treating him as if he's any different from the gods of the nations when he's very different. And all the holiness laws, it's not just a practical code of conduct. It's a description of what it looks like to belong to the Lord. It's being called out from the rest of the nations. I mean, if they, think about that even for us. If we take the commands about sexual sin seriously in our own lives, how much will we stand out from the culture around us? A little bit? A lot, right? Because we prioritize the relationship we have with the Lord over everything else, and we say he commands us about these things. Now, I don't expect the culture to fall in line with that because they don't worship our God. Why should they? But if we belong to the Lord, then we're light in the darkness, and sexual sin is one of the things that makes you very distinct from the culture around you, is if you choose to handle sexual relationships in the way that the Lord commands. So it's powerful. Let me read the last quote for you. The beliefs and customs of the world appeal to human nature, and they might even seem reasonable, but the truth is that God's order for life is better than the world's customs in every way. It's an order of life that keeps boundaries, and it makes distinctions for the physical, emotional, and spiritual good of his people. It's a pattern that maintains harmony and does not introduce confusion. It promotes faithful love in the family and not lust. It is life-giving and life-enhancing rather than sterile and self-gratifying. But most important, it establishes a life based on the divine revelation of a sovereign and holy God, not patterned after the spirit of the age or false religious ideas that are forever associated with destruction and death. The application to that is timeless. We should not be surprised to see the same violations of God's law abound in the modern world, nor should we be surprised to discover that indulgence in immoral practices invariably leads to the reworking of religious standards to allow for such practices. I mean, we see it, don't we? Just day in and day out. But worship of the Lord means, I mean, we talked about before, how much does holiness cover in your life? The whole of it. What you become what you worship. And so ultimately, worship and the way you live life they cannot be disconnected. Those things are inseparable. Who you worship and how you live will always be connected to you. Okay, I need to stop talking. Comments? Is there anything you would like to add?
Did they put people to death other than stoning? Do you know? Because it's not specified with each of these.
There are some places where it's with a sword, although that doesn't seem to be communal.
Burning.
Yeah, yes. Although that doesn't show up very often. Stoning is much more common. But, yeah.
And then I was thinking how Peter was told
told he could eat anything
Mm-hmm.
apart from the law.
Yep.
But the sexual sins were never said it's okay.
No, in fact, Paul,
He says we're the temple
yes,
of
And
the
that-
holy God.
yes.
And we're not to violate that temple.
right. And the whole argument in, well, at the end of Romans 1, and then also in 1 Corinthians 5 and 6, I think that whole argument by Paul has Levitcus in the background of it. This idea that if you're in covenant relationship with the Lord, what you do with your body is what Christ does with his body. I mean, there's a union with Christ that is very important. And so Paul says, you know, all kinds of things are permissible, but why would you be doing things that dishonor the Lord? Because your union with him now is the highest priority that you have. And not only that, he says, you know, sexual sin is the sin that you commit against yourself. I mean, think about that, just the weight of sexual sin and what it does to you. And Paul says, you know, if you are the temple of the Lord, why would you sin against yourself that way? Because there's a disordering that happens with sexual sin that's very powerful. Although, well, we talked about this, I think a couple weeks ago too, but you know in 1 Corinthians where there's the guy who's sleeping with his stepmother, right? In the church. And Paul confronts them about that because he says, there's this guy sleeping with his stepmother, and you guys not only allow it, it's like you're proud of it. Like you think freedom in Christ means you just sleep with whoever you want, it doesn't matter. And he said, even the pagans know better than that. Like that's a sin they don't even put up with. And you know what the law just said about that kind of sin. So what does Paul tell the church to do? Cut the guy off, right? He says cut him off. Put him out of the fellowship of the church. Because, I don't know if you remember that bit, but Paul says because a little yeast leavens the whole loaf. What is he concerned, I mean, what's his concern? If they put up with it, it'll spread. That kind of sexual sin will spread. So he says put him out of the church, and it's pretty brutal. He's like, be done with this. Cut this guy off. But of course the happy ending in 2 Corinthians is that the guy repents. He turns away from his sin, he comes back, and Paul says, okay, if he repented, now bring him back into the church, bring him fully back into fellowship, because he's forgiven. The Lord has forgiven him, forgive him as well, and bring him back in. So Paul takes these sins very seriously. Of course, it's different because, you know, we're not under the old covenant, and it's not a particular nation that is doing all of this, but Paul says these sins, idolatry and sexual sin are profoundly connected. And so deal seriously with sexual sin.
There was one area, I think if a man's case with his daughter-in-law, it's a perversion put to death. And I was thinking about, I can't think of her name, but her husband died, and she went to the father, and she made
Oh,
herself-
yeah, Tamar.
Thank you.
Yep.
What about that situation? Does that relate to this?
Well, he didn't do what he was supposed to do.
No.
His sons didn't do what they were supposed to do. She was a Canaanite.
Yeah, okay.
So, I mean, yeah, but
Does
it
fit
was.
in here?
What's that?
Would it fit into this? I
Mm,
mean,
because she's a Canaanite, although he's an Israelite, but the problem is that, you know, he's not doing what he's supposed to
Yeah.
do. And she's going to be destitute because her father-in-law's not doing what he's supposed to. But it's complicated. Sexual sin makes everything complicated. Okay, any last things you're just itching to?
So what Sue was talking about, was it a sin for an Israelite man to go into a prostitute?
Yes.
Okay.
that must have been really something to be found out. I mean, if he was.
She trapped him. She was pretty sharp. Yeah.